In the 90s and very early 2000s, there were a lot of Pokemon spin-offs. Pinball, the TCG on the Game Boy, Hey You Pikachu, Puzzle League, Pokemon Snap. But the one that a lot of kids got excited for when it came to the Nintendo 64 spin-offs was Pokemon Stadium. While Pokemon Snap was the first 3D Pokemon game we got in the West, Stadium came out in Japan first. Though the version of Stadium we finally got is actually called Pokemon Stadium 2 in Japan? It's complicated. But basically, this version is the more complete version of the first Pokemon Stadium game in Japan, and is the Gen 1 standard N64 Pokemon game to play if you want anything that mostly resembles your Gen 1 Game Boy games mechanically. Though there are some small changes, like sleep only lasting 1 to 3 turns, and bug fixes like Paralyze no longer extending the invulnerability phase of moves like Dig incorrectly, and Focus Energy actually working now. There's a lot as you can see here, including the game adhering to mostly traditional tournament rules like sleep clause functioning in-game and such. So Pokemon Stadium filled a specific niche with hardcore fans at the time, being an alternate way to do competitive battling with some different balance changes due to some changes here and there from the original Game Boy Gen 1 games. So with this game, I feel like there's a bit of explaining to do before I really dig into the list. Earlier this year, Pokemon Stadium was released for the Nintendo Switch online service, and as I'm making this video, Pokemon Stadium 2 has also been released. Now, if you're playing on the actual Nintendo 64, you can use a transfer pack to use your Pokemon from your actual Gen 1 and 2 games for the Game Boy in-game, with stuff like their stats and movesets intact. But unfortunately, it's not possible to bring any of your Pokemon from any version of your old games, including the 3DS ports in this Nintendo Switch Online version. You can only use the Pokemon available to you in Stadium's rental system, where Pokemon have their own set stats and movesets, which are not able to be altered or edited. What you see on a Pokemon is what you get. Depending on the tier you chose, they are the only versions of the available Pokemon you'll be able to use, and it's actually considered its own meta. Smogon even has the Pokécup tier stats and movesets readily available on the page for Pokemon in the red and blue section of your strategy Pokédex, for those that just want to play it on Pokemon Showdown. And as you can see in the title, I'm here to ask the question: what are the top 10 best rental Pokemon in the first Pokemon Stadium? Well, if you're not familiar with the concept of rental Pokemon in Stadium, they're basically Pokemon with already set stats and movesets. This Venusaur you're looking at right here in the Pokécup tier? That's it. That's the moveset. You either take it or leave it. This means deciding which Pokemon are good or bad is more based on not only the movesets they're left with, but also stuff like the DVs they're left with. Basically, the DVs on a Pokemon like Dragonite are non-existent, but other Pokemon that don't have a large base stat total may be spared from this fate, likely to balance the roster a little bit. This, and the game being very harsh on final stage evolution Pokemon in terms of movesets, like Venusaur in comparison to Ivysaur, means that you may find yourself thinking a pre-evolution is better. It's very weird, and I have mixed feelings on how it's executed. Dragonite in particular has a terrible moveset. Even if it had Wrap, partial trapping is basically a dead concept in Stadium due to its nerf. Now, I think I've talked enough about some of the nuances surrounding this game, but before we get to the top 10, let's do a few honorable mentions. Specifically, the Pokemon I think stand out in the Petite Cup format, which is basically like Little Cup, though still not exactly the same. It's the tier for unevolved Pokemon, or those that just have lower stats, like Charmander and Farfetch'd. The 4 Pokemon I'll shout out in the Petite Cup are Rattata, Kabuto, Voltorb, and Eevee. Unfortunately, a lot of movesets feel stunted even in Little Cup, as they're not the same for these same unevolved Pokemon in the standard Pokécup and Anything Goes format. So I was pretty surprised when I saw that Rattata actually manages to be something that still has a different solid moveset compared to the others. Hyper Fang is a good stab attack. Quick Attack can function as priority if you need to finish things off, and Bubble Beam takes out its rock type counters easily. Not to mention it's a fast Pokemon. Speaking of fast Pokemon, Voltorb is decent, if only because it's a fast Pokemon with Thunder Wave, which is a huge deal in Gen 1. Otherwise, it's fine. It hits hard enough, but it's that near guarantee paralysis that's super appealing and not too common in this tier. Kabuto is similar to Rattata, in that it just has a good moveset, and Eevee is in a similar position too. Eevee both being able to hit hard and set up a substitute, a move which was buffed from the original Gen 1 games, as it's no longer able to be hit by status affecting moves that cause things like paralysis, and it's totally immune to HP absorbing attacks. Lastly, I'll shout out Ghastly and Dratini as Pokemon with potential in the format too. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me clarify that the top 10 itself will be based on the Pokecup format and Anything Goes format, which when relegated to rentals only is exactly the same as Pokecup, but instead it's 6v6 and not 3v3. But I'll be keeping both 3v3 and 6v6 in mind here, as some may be interested in 3v3, as not only is that the part of an old school Japanese meta, but 3v3 is also the format you'll be usually doing in single player content, which is basically just competitive against NPCs. The Prime Cup may also interest you, but keep in mind that I'm not factoring it into this list at all, as it's not the typical standard play for Stadium and the movesets are totally different. Anyway, let's finally get to the list. At number 10, we have a Pokemon that fills a tough to fill niche here that would normally be filled by a Rhydon in red, blue, and yellow. It's Graveler? Yeah, Graveler, not Golem. Unfortunately, Golem's moveset is just so bad that Graveler takes its spot easily. And so does Geodude. Seriously, it's so weird to see Golem with Metronome of all things. Graveler thankfully picks up the slack by having Earthquake and a self-destruct option. Honestly, the Stab Earthquake alone, while being able to risk the powerful Stab normal attacks of Gen 1, are enough to make it a surprisingly popular choice in Stadium rentals. The rest of Graveler isn't terribly impressive. It's just that it happens to be the best at filling that defensive rock-type niche that puts it up here. Geodude also has a better moveset, and of course at the cost of lesser stats, though not as bad as you may expect. I'll also give a shout out to Rhyhorn for filling out this role pretty well, also having a better moveset than Graveler. Its stats are also not as good, however, but it's a decent alternative option if it looks more appealing to you. What about Rhydon, you ask? Well, look at that moveset. That's like the moveset we would have loved on it when we were kids, but the reality is it's pretty terrible for Rhydon in a serious match. I didn't have this one written down for the top 10 at first, but after a while, I kinda grew to feel that this one was a bit underrated compared to how other people felt about it while playing rentals, and that's Lapras. Everything Lapras has here is useful, except for Solar Beam, which I don't think I can find a use for in Gen 1, outside of maybe single player stuff in red, blue, and yellow. The issue here is that you'd usually rather have Blizzard over Ice Beam, as Blizzard's accuracy is still 90% in this game, but Ice Beam will have to do. Sing is admittedly not as good with the nerf to Sleep in Stadium, and of course just not being as good as Sleep Powder. But if you get a good roll on it, it can save you from losing a matchup. Body Slam is a solid alternative move, as Lapras' physical attack is pretty good, and the paralysis chance can ruin the game's best offensive threats. But I think on top of all of this, it's Lapras' HP that sticks out the most. I would say the main flaw of Lapras is that it doesn't outright fill a super unique role, other than being a very bulky sea creature that hits for good damage with an unreliable sleep option. This is gonna shock a lot of you, but here at number 8, we have Tauros. Yeah, Tauros doesn't make the top 3. Certainly not for me, and certainly not for a lot of other people apparently. Tauros is unfortunately cursed by bad moveset options in rentals. Double Edge, Fire Blast, Bide, and Tail Whip. Those last two are just a complete joke. This poor rental Tauros is just daydreaming of better days when it was using Body Slam in red, blue, and yellow. So why is it still even in the top 10? Well, at the end of the day, Tauros is still really fast and really strong, so Double Edge is still terrifying. And if it's a 3v3 situation, that's less recoil hits it needs to be wary of before sweeping your team. That's assuming you're not one-shotting literally everything, in which case recoil won't even affect you in the match. Fire Blast is not an unheard of option for Tauros, but still very rare. Usually only thought of being used to burn another Tauros or something to cripple it. You're pretty much just a stab attack machine with this set, in most cases. And Tauros is so strong in Gen 1 that just Double Edge alone still manages to put it at number 8. Exeggutor is a weird one. It doesn't have any of that psychic stab that you'd love to see from it, yet it still ends up being pretty good in spite of that. Mega Drain is an incredible attack, and Stun Spore is excellent. Paralysis feels even better than usual. Leech Seed is also not bad. Even Egg Bomb isn't a completely terrible move as a last resort in a bad matchup. It just has that unfortunate accuracy. Its bulk is still pretty decent too, and the Psychic typing still feels good defensively. If it had Psychic instead of Egg Bomb though, it'd probably be top 4 or something. I can't believe Zapdos gets to be one place higher than it was in our red and blue video from months back. With its nerfed but still very solid stats, Zapdos with Thunderbolt and Thunderwave alone makes it very good in rentals. Unfortunately, its Fly Stab is Sky Attack, which does amazing damage, but is one of those cursed 2-turn attack moves. If you can find a way to get it to work out though, then it'll be worth it. But we'd all rather have Drill Peck. Not too much else to say about Zapdos, honestly. It's the usual shtick of good speed, good stab, and that oh so important Thunderwave. The only really bad thing is that it feels like Pokemon with Ice Stab feel more common than usual on good teams, at least in my experience. So Zapdos doesn't feel as sturdy as usual, even beyond feeling less bulky. Another Pokemon that's higher on the list compared to Red, Blue, and Yellow is Jinx. In fact, Jinx would probably be even higher for me if we were only talking about 3v3, where it excels in rule sets like Nintendo Cup 97. Having Stab Psychic alone is so good already. Blizzard would have been nice, but Ice Punch isn't completely terrible, and is a case of better than nothing. With some of the matches I got to see, you'd think that Ice Punch has an increased chance to freeze. But no, it's still the usual 10%. I guess we got to see some insane luck in this match here. Lovely Kiss is still one of the best sleep moves, but with the nerf to sleep compared to Red, Blue, and Yellow, you'll need to choose when to use it wisely. Mega Punch actually isn't too bad. It mostly sees use against other Psychic types that have low defense. I think Jinx sits pretty comfortably as a top 5 pick, and I think it would at least make people's top 10 at the very least. This spot is kinda shared by 2 Pokemon, Gengar and Haunter. I've noticed that a lot of people that judge rental Pokemon are a bit undecided between which of these 2 is better in rentals. Gengar has the reliable Confuse Ray and a really powerful Thunderbolt, and Nightshade is alright too if you need to use a different attack. Haunter, on the other hand, has the rare rental moveset where every move is actually good. Mega Drain, Confuse Ray, Psychic, Explosion? I have to admit, I think it's close, but I find Haunter slightly better between the 2, though it really depends on what you want on your team composition. I wouldn't recommend using both on a 3v3 team, but they're pretty good together in 6v6 rentals, which I imagine would be more popular with most of you watching. I also think the Ghost typing is excellent against some of the normal stab options in the game, like Raticate and of course Tauros. Avoiding rental Snorlax's Mega Kick would also be good, because while Mega Kick's accuracy is unfortunate, getting hit by it is devastating. But overall, both Gengar and Haunter are fantastic, and I'm definitely taking one of them with me if I'm being serious about my team. Here we have a Pokemon that's usually in the shadow of Zapdos in many instances in Red, Blue, and Yellow, but not here. Rental Jolteon is still blazing fast, being only slower than Electrode. Its speed and reliable Thunderbolt stab alone make it top tier in this meta, and even Pin Missile is a pretty decent option here against some of the Psychics, and it's sometimes even used in Red, Blue, and Yellow as an option. And with high speed, it has a pretty good crit chance in Gen 1. Toxic can be made to be a good choice in certain situations, but it's not really something I see used much from Jolteon in Gen 1. The only major issue I have with it, outside of just the usual fact that rentals feel like they have an incomplete moveset, is that Stadium's format lets you see the 6 Pokemon that were chosen by your opponent before you decide your 3 Pokemon or the first of your 6 Pokemon, depending on if you're doing 3v3 or 6v6. I feel like the lack of a surprise factor from Pokemon like Jolteon, Zapdos, and even Graveler can hurt them a bit. They don't feel quite as scary when you see them coming. And in Jolteon's case, it means they can potentially prepare for your late game sweep. Still, I think its strengths make it the best overall electric type in Stadium rentals. This is a Pokemon that always barely gets out of my top 10s pretty often, so I'm happy to be able to justifiably put this fellow evolution high on the list. You know who got done dirty in this game? Alakazam. Have you ever seen an Alakazam without Psychic? Especially in Gen 1? Like, look at this thing. Take a good look at it. This is one of the most bizarre movesets ever. This means Kadabra, who actually has Psychic and Recover, is our number 2 spot instead of Alakazam. Kadabra is one of the best Pokemon in Stadium easily. And you know what? So is Abra, with basically a perfect moveset. Unfortunately, Abra's stats hold it back in comparison to Kadabra, so I think Kadabra is still better, even with the painful lack of Thunder Wave. But Abra is worth keeping an eye on. Kadabra's only major weakness are beefy normal types like Tauros one-shotting it with stab attacks. Normal stab was already a problem for it in Red, Blue, and Yellow, and was kind of a counter depending on the situation, and it feels worse here. But even so, it returns the favor to an insane amount of other Pokemon in the meta, so it's all fair game. Recover is also pretty rare in rentals. Most Pokemon don't have any self-healing outside of a Drain or Leech Seed or something, and it feels good to have here. Overall, this evolution line has always been revered in Gen 1, and Kadabra follows the trend of Psychic feeling nearly unstoppable in Generation 1 if you have no idea what you're doing. Now, I want to make one thing clear before we get to number 1. I kinda sorta banned Chansey for making this list. Why? Because it has Minimize, which is normally banned. But, yeah. I mean, look at this match that goes on forever because Minimize wasn't banned. It's just pure misery. The rest of its moveset is not the typical Chansey moveset either, so without it, it's not great anyway. But I felt like I needed to point out the fact that I'm counting an evasion ban on this list before getting the number 1. I never thought this thing would be number 1 on any of my strongest Pokemon lists. But because of the nature of how Gen 1 crits work, and just how much this thing only needs one move to really be good, it's kind of hard to put anything else here. And who is number 1, you might be asking? Persian. Persian really just needs Slash. Its other move would normally be Hyper Beam. But Hyper Beam is nerfed in Stadium, needing to recharge after a KO like any other game now. Also, that Bubble Beam coverage it has in rentals, it's actually not useless, as it gives a one-hit KO option against the rock types like Graveler and Rhyhorn. And with the way Bulk is nerfed, almost across the board in rentals, Slash basically destroys everything that can't resist it in 2 hits or less, with a few exceptions. The normal typing is also generally a very good thing, as there aren't many rock types that get used. And fighting types aren't very good yet, and are lacking options in Gen 1 compared to what comes after. Persian is kind of like the Red, Blue, and Yellow Tauros of Gen 1 Stadium. And this isn't even a hot take. Most people that have approached this subject with any sincerity also tends to feel that Persian is at least like a top 2 Pokemon. The only thing I don't like about Persian is that it's played pretty one-dimensionally. The only time it's not is when you're doing some insane strat that involves Mimic, which it has in its Reynolds moveset. And it can also just kinda be fun to mess with. Imagine stealing Thunder Wave, Psychic, or Mega Drain. But it could be useful long term in a match to complete a sweep. Overall, this is the most consistent Pokemon in Rentals. Anyone that's playing to win against another player is going to put it in their team. And that's it, the top 10 strongest rentals in Pokemon Stadium. I was planning this for a while, and it was a lot of fun to revisit the game for this list. Hopefully, it was a nice trip down memory lane for some of you. I actually find Stadium to make Pokemon competitive battling very accessible for those of you that have never tried it. You don't need to set up the movesets, and you can pick almost anything. It's basically plug and play battling, and you can play it right on the Switch with your friends online too. And now the sequel is also out. So, did you agree with this list? Any interest in seeing Pokemon Stadium 2 covered? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below.